Something happened in mid-December that most Americans haven't heard about yet. But you're going to feel it. Not a single oil tanker from Venezuela has docked in Cuban ports since then. Not one. According to shipping data I've been tracking, the flow that kept 11 million people from total darkness just stopped. Completely. Now here's why you should care. I've spent 2 decades watching energy crises unfold. From California to Texas to Europe. And what I'm seeing in Cuba right now isn't just another blackout story for the evening news. It's the blueprint. The exact sequence of events that happens before a modern economy goes dark. And the mechanisms driving this collapse are already at work, in ways most analysts are completely missing. The question isn't whether Cuba's system fails. That's already happening. The question is what comes next, when an entire nation loses power, and what that tells us about vulnerabilities closer to home than anyone wants to admit. Let me show you what the data actually reveals. October 2024. The Antonio Guterres power plant goes offline. 1,640 megawatts of capacity gone. The headlines called it an accident, a maintenance failure. What they didn't tell you is that the Antonio Guterres shutdown wasn't the problem. It was the symptom of something far worse that had been building for years. Here's what I found digging through Cuba's state utility data from Unión Eléctrica. Throughout 2025, the generation shortfalls regularly hit 1,300 to 1,700 megawatts during peak demand hours. On a grid that can barely squeeze out 3,000 megawatts on its best day, that means nearly half the country's electricity demand goes unmet. Every single day. Think about that for a second. Imagine if half of New York City went dark every evening. Not for an hour. For 10 hours. 12 hours. Sometimes 20 hours straight. That's not a crisis. That's a collapse in slow motion. But here's where it gets interesting. By November 23rd, the system started the day with only 1,505 megawatts available, against demand of 2,214 megawatts. That left 721 megawatts of consumers without power from sunrise. Havana, the capital, usually shielded from the worst outages, experienced blackouts lasting over 10 hours. In rural areas, the power didn't come back for an entire day. Now here's what nobody's connecting. Cuba runs on 8 major thermoelectric plants. Most were built in the 1960s and 70s. 3 of them are completely offline right now. The remaining 5 operate at just 25% of installed capacity. Antonio Guterres, Nuevitas, Rente, Felton. These aren't just names on a grid. These are the only things standing between 11 million people and permanent darkness. And they're failing. Jorge Piñón at the University of Texas Energy Institute tracks Cuban oil shipments using satellite technology. He revealed something critical. Even before Venezuela stopped shipping, Cuba was receiving about 35,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, 5,500 daily from Mexico, roughly 7,500 from Russia, total of 48,000 barrels per day. And even with all that oil flowing, the blackouts were already happening. Here's why that number matters. Venezuela wasn't supplying 50% of Cuba's total oil needs. It was supplying 50% of the deficit. The gap between what Cuba produces and what it actually needs to function. When you're already running on empty and you lose half your emergency supply, the math becomes catastrophic. But the real problem is what that oil does to the equipment. These thermal plants burn heavy crude with extremely high metal content. It's corrosive. Technicians on the ground report operating units with improvised parts, cooling systems and boilers literally held together by hand repairs. They fix a unit, bring it back online, and within 60 to 90 days it fails again because of fuel quality and lack of replacement parts. It's a death spiral. Each repair is temporary. Each failure compounds the next. And there's no way out. Independent economists estimate that just stabilizing Cuba's electricity grid, not upgrading it, just keeping it from total collapse, would require $8 to $10 billion. For context, Cuba's GDP fell 1.1% in 2024, marking an 11% cumulative contraction over 5 years. The country doesn't have $8 billion. It doesn't have access to international credit. And it can't generate that kind of revenue internally. In February 2025, 5 Turkish floating power plants leased by Cuba sailed out of Cuban ports after the government failed to pay. Those power ships were providing 20% of the country's electricity. When they left, that capacity vanished overnight. This isn't about money anymore. This is about a government that can no longer perform the basic functions of a modern state. The government announced plans for 92 solar farms by 2028 in partnership with China. The first opened in February 2025. By mid-year, Cuba had 33 new solar parks contributing about 2,400 megawatt-hours, with a peak of 470 megawatts. Sounds promising until you realize that's a fraction of the daily shortfall. Solar helps at noon, but when the sun sets and demand spikes, those megawatts disappear. And only 4 of the 55 planned facilities include battery storage. The government's goal is 37% renewable energy by 2030. Current renewable share? Less than 5%. Even if every solar park gets built on schedule, which current finances make impossible, the path from 5 to 37% takes decades. And Cuba doesn't have decades. It might not have months. January 3, 2026. U.S. Military forces capture Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in an operation that reshapes the entire region overnight. The headlines focused on the capture itself. But the second-order effects are where the real story begins. Since Hugo Chavez rose to power in Venezuela in 1999, Cuba depended on Venezuelan oil in exchange for Cuban doctors, military advisors, and intelligence operatives. This wasn't commerce. It was a strategic alliance held together by ideology and mutual survival. Venezuela sent oil. Cuba sent the people who helped keep Chavez, and later Maduro, in power. That arrangement just ended. According to Reuters and shipping manifests, 0 crude oil or fuel shipments from Venezuela since mid-December. On January 11th, President Trump made the position explicit on Truth Social. There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. 0. I strongly suggest they make a deal before it's too late. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Senator Lindsey Graham said the same thing. Cuba's government will fall unless Havana cuts a deal with Washington. And here's the part that should make you pay attention. Pavel Vidal, former Cuban central bank economist, put it plainly. If the oil supply ceases entirely, the Cuban economy grinds to a halt. Not recession, not contraction. A halt. This would be a devastating blow to an economy already in its 6th year of recession, lacking the productive capacity, competitiveness, or foreign currency to replace those flows. Let me walk you through what that actually means on the ground, because this is where theory becomes reality. Without electricity, water pumps don't run. No running water in homes, hospitals, schools. Refrigeration becomes unreliable, threatening food and medicine storage. In a country already experiencing severe food shortages, the inability to preserve what little exists accelerates the crisis exponentially. Internet and communications go dark during outages, cutting Cuba off from the world precisely when connection matters most. Small businesses lose productive hours without backup generators. The tourism industry, one of Cuba's last remaining revenue sources, collapses as hotels and restaurants try maintaining services amid 20-hour blackouts. Who books a Caribbean vacation to sit in the dark? Tourism was the second largest source of foreign currency. That's gone now. Hospitals depend on emergency generators. But generators need diesel. Diesel is scarce. Healthcare. Facilities face the nightmare of choosing which wards get power and which go dark. The social math is predictable. Frustration builds. Protests erupt. September 2025. Residents in Havana and Holguin take to the streets banging pots shouting, "We want light," and "Enough blackouts." These weren't isolated events. They reflected accumulated rage after years of broken government promises. President Miguel Díaz-Canel warned protesters would be processed rigorously under our revolutionary law, appearing on television in military fatigues. He blamed counter-revolutionaries from abroad for fomenting unrest. Classic authoritarian playbook. Blame external enemies when internal systems fail. But Díaz-Canel can't talk his way out of economics. During a December speech to the National Assembly, he admitted the gross domestic product decreased over 4%. Inflation surged. The economy was partially paralyzed. Foreign currency revenues fell 30%. The import-dependent island can't buy the food, medicine, or fuel it needs. Michael Gallant at the Center for Economic and Policy Research characterized this as intentional economic warfare. The goal, he argued, is causing such suffering in the civilian population as to trigger uprising or regime change. Whether that works is uncertain. Cubans have endured economic hardship for decades, but there are limits to resilience when basic services collapse entirely. Jorge Duani, at Florida International University's Cuban Research Institute, warned that an indefinite electrical system shutdown, no longer impossible under total suspension of Venezuelan oil, would lead to mass protests. It would also trigger something else: mass exodus. We've seen this pattern before. After 2021 protests amid COVID and worsening conditions, Cuba experienced record emigration. Fiscal year 2023 saw 200,287 Cuban migrant encounters at U.S. borders. Fiscal year 2024 jumped to 217,615. Those aren't statistics. Those are families, professionals, young people concluding there's no future on the island. 16-year-old Cuban student Amanda Gomez told reporters, "I'd be lying if I said I don't want to leave. We're all thinking about it, from youngest to oldest." That sentiment, multiplied across millions, is the real danger for any government. When your population sees emigration as the only rational choice, you don't have a country. You have a sinking ship. Cuba's options are limited and shrinking fast. Mexico has become an important crude supplier, according to President Claudia Sheinbaum. But Trump suggested the U.S. can pressure Mexico, warning about drugs pouring through the border. If Mexico faces heat to cut Cuba shipments, that lifeline disappears. Russia provides about 7,500 barrels daily, but Russian oil comes with sanctions complications and logistical nightmares. Cuba cannot survive on 7,500 barrels per day. It couldn't even survive on the 48,000 it was getting before Venezuela stopped. The gap is too wide. And unlike previous crises, there's no Soviet Union waiting in the wings. No Hugo Chavez offering ideological solidarity backed by oil subsidies. Cuba is, for the first time in decades, completely alone. Energy experts like Jorge Piñón note that even if alternative arrangements emerge, timing matters. Every day without adequate oil means another day of rolling blackouts, another day of economic activity lost, another day of public frustration compounding. The question isn't whether Cuba finds replacement oil. It's whether it finds enough, fast enough, to prevent total collapse. Here's the broader lesson Americans need to understand. Energy independence isn't a campaign slogan. It's the difference between stability and chaos. When a nation becomes dependent on a single supplier, especially one linked by ideology rather than market forces, that dependency becomes a weapon. Venezuela could cut Cuba off because Cuba had no alternatives. The U.S. could pressure Mexico and interdict tankers because Cuba operates from a position of zero leverage. Compare that to the United States. which spent 15 years transforming from net energy importer to net exporter through shale oil and natural gas production. That wasn't just about jobs or trade balances. It was about ensuring no foreign government could turn off American lights by cutting supply. Energy security is national security. Cuba proves that beyond debate. The collapse we're watching didn't happen overnight. It happened through decades of underinvestment, over-reliance on external support, and refusal to reform an economic model incapable of generating wealth necessary to maintain basic infrastructure. The Venezuelan oil cutoff didn't cause the crisis. It exposed a system that was already broken. So where does this leave Cuba? And more importantly, what does it tell us? Economists predict that without dramatic intervention, the island faces what Pavel Vidal called a grinding halt. Food shortages worsen, medical services degrade, emigration accelerates, social unrest increases. The government faces choices between repression and reform, and history suggests which path authoritarian regimes choose. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba entered the special period. The economy contracted 30%. The government survived, but it took 4 years to hit bottom and begin recovery. Tourism, remittances, and limited foreign investment helped stabilize things. This time, those safety valves may not exist. Tourism is down. Remittances face restrictions. Foreign investors watching a government that couldn't pay Turkish companies for power plants aren't lining up to sink billions into Cuban infrastructure. The renewable energy push faces the same wall. Each solar park costs $16 million for imported equipment plus domestic investment. Multiply that across dozens of facilities, add battery storage that only 4 parks will have, and you're looking at financing Cuba simply cannot secure. China provides equipment and expertise, but even China isn't writing blank checks to a government with Cuba's debt repayment history. The Trump administration's strategy appears designed to force exactly this reckoning. Cut off Venezuelan oil, pressure alternative suppliers, create conditions where the Cuban government must either negotiate from extreme weakness or face internal collapse. Whether that produces regime change or simply prolonged suffering remains to be seen. What's certain is that Cuba's energy crisis represents more than a regional problem. It's a case study in 21st-century economic collapse mechanics. Energy scarcity triggers economic contraction. Economic contraction breeds social instability. Social instability drives emigration and potential regime failure. Each stage reinforces the next until outside intervention or fundamental reform breaks the cycle. For Americans, the lesson cuts deep. The stability we take for granted, lights that work when we flip a switch, water that flows when we turn a tap. These aren't natural laws. They're products of massive infrastructure investment, diverse energy sources, and economic systems capable of generating wealth to maintain them. When those systems fail, collapse doesn't announce itself. It arrives, quietly, one blackout at a time, until the darkness becomes permanent. Cuba's energy lifeline is failing. The collapse has begun. And how it ends will reveal what happens when nations run out of power, options, and time simultaneously. But here's what keeps me up at night. The mechanisms at work in Cuba, the dependency, the infrastructure decay, the political calculus of using energy as a weapon. These aren't unique to the Caribbean. They're patterns. And patterns repeat. If this breakdown revealed something the mainstream coverage missed, subscribe now. We're not just tracking headlines. We're connecting the dots between energy, economics, and geopolitical leverage that determine which nations survive and which go dark. Comment below with your analysis. Is Cuba's crisis a preview of vulnerabilities in other energy-dependent regions? What happens when the next country loses its lifeline? Let's discuss what nobody else is willing to say. Until next time, keep watching the patterns.